Bryan, thanks so much for taking the time to have this conversation. I'm very interested in learning what you have to say. So you are a preparedness expert, and a lot of people, use the word prepper, what have you. You've seen TV shows on this, and what's interesting to me is that suddenly people are taking this a lot more seriously in the recent past since COVID, let's say, than maybe they have before. How'd you get to be doing what you're doing? I mean, how'd you get into this?
So my wife and I lived in New York when 9/11 occurred, and being there firsthand in the state, seeing the chaos, seeing the disorder, seeing the panic that occurred right away, seeing the gas lines form, fights occurring in the gas line. It was the first experience we had right after the military that normalcy had set in. In other words, people thought today is going to be just like tomorrow, and when it wasn't, it was extremely chaotic and very unprepared for a lot of people out there.
So it just got you started to research it for your own, saying, okay, I don't want to be caught by surprise again. I want to be ready for something like this. So what were your first steps? What was the journey like?
So the journey started with me actually journaling what I needed to prepare. And this is long before the survival triangle was developed. I had separated from the military, so I had some insight into what we needed. So it all started, and within a month or two, I began looking at food, water, heat, shelter, and self-preparedness. I took notes on everything I felt that we would need. There was a huge gap, not only in what we needed to prepare, but also our skill set, all the way from gardening, to proficient use of firearms, to building a community, to preserving food, etc. Began journaling that long before I knew it. Family, friends, colleagues were asking for my notes because they had also been through 9/11, and eventually it led to a publication.
You've published how many books? Is there one book, or you published more than one book on this?
I've got about 14 books.
That's
ranging from preparedness to actually fiction.
Yeah. And in fiction, basically, you're laying out, I guess, these strategies, but in fictional form, so that you can kind of follow the trail and how this might unfold. So let's, if we can, dive into some of the practical aspects. So if I were starting at zero, saying, okay, I'm absolutely, I don't need any convincing that getting prepared is a good idea, but I haven't really thought about it much before. Maybe some people say, well, I guess logically I need to have maybe some water, some food, but how do you store it? What kind of food is it? What are the categories that I have to consider, and what are the best strategies for me?
So again, I would come back to the survival triangle. It's a very simple model. Food, water on one corner, heat, shelter, and then self-preservation skills. And you cover up any corner, and what it shows is that yes, you may have two of these skills that are required, but you're missing the one. They're all three intertwined. And so it's very important for people to understand that when you prepare, it's just not firearms and ammunition. And that's the most common theme I hear out there. Well, I got guns and I have this. Yeah, but it's not, it's useless without food, water, or the skills how to purify water, or the food, skills how to do long-term food preservation methods, from mylar to smoking to salting. You have to know that. And then again, depending on where you are, you have to understand, if something happens, am I going to stay at my primary location? Am I going to get in a car and go somewhere else? Am I going to go to a cabin, a family member's house? And so I always encourage, when I do consulting, it's just understand the premise of the model. And then what we do is we go through a self-assessment. What is prepping to you? What is preparedness to you? Because it's definitely different for me than some of the people out there that I consult. So it's that foundation of understanding where we're headed, and then getting their understanding of where they feel they want to head.
So if we can maybe go through the triangle a bit, maybe start with food and water. What are some of the foundations or premises around food and water? How much do I need to store? What you talked about smoking, salting, and other type things. So how do I approach it? Let's start in that dimension.
So the easiest thing is I teach people is let's start with the comfort foods that you're used to. For example, a lot of people, we buy canned goods. So I said, let's start with copy canning. So every time we call it copy canning, because every time you buy for example, a can of green beans. Next time you go, buy 2 cans. And then you got 2 cans. When you use one, buy 2 more cans. And eventually their food storage will grow. Once we have identified their comfort foods, because that's the easiest way to start, then we start going into the long-term foods storage, the daily staples that people lived on in the 1800s, wheat, beans, rice, because there's a lot of different protein. And not only that, there's a lot of long-term storage. So I like to start with what they know, and then eventually build on that. And then the second thing I look at in water is if an incident were to happen, of course, my biggest fear is an electromagnetic pulse or a cyber attack, is, what are your water sources? And it's not enough to have one. Do you have water stored? Do you have a creek by you? Do you know how to purify water? Can you use bleach to purify water? Do you have other mechanical means, to purify water, such as a katadine? I mean, obviously boiling is the most fundamental technology to boil water. So we just kind of go through the different food categories, how many family members they have. And I will tell you, the most important aspect for me of being prepared is being a prepper is a short-term means of survival. So what do you do when all your food runs out? Well, you got to know how to garden. You got to know how to seed save. What are you going to do when you don't have electricity? For example, how are you going to keep things cool? So I focus them on short term, and then eventually we get to the long term in some homesteading skills that would keep them going long term.
So I imagine the considerations are very different if you live in New York City versus if you live in upstate New York, Woodstock area or something like that, right? Because in New York City, you're not, there's not a stream that you're going to get water from to purify water, so you have to think in different terms. And I have to imagine the toughest environment is a crowded urban environment to try to manage through something like this. I guess there are still things they can do for short term, to make sure that they can get through a short term. But as you said, we could end up in a long term scenario. I imagine you looked with interest at what happened in Texas recently with the storms, and I heard people, I had experts tell me, actually one of them in Texas who works in that world, in the energy world, say that they were minutes away from losing the grid for months. And what could that have meant, to say, you can't get water, you're probably not gonna get food, there's, what all the dominoes that fall when that happens. We got, it's not like, hey, this could be coming. We got very close right there, and it's almost inevitable that in some regions, some event's going to occur, and people need to be prepared. Now we're in this COVID world. There's a lot of uncertainty. It could be financial and economic collapse, which I think is a very real possibility. More when, not if. And as you said, EMPs, other things. There's a lot of threats on the horizon. So this is, and I'm saying all this because I'd like to. I think Einstein said once, make things as simple as possible, just not simpler. So I don't think we could oversimplify, one size fits all. I think it has context for where you live, what you can do. But I guess one thing, if we start with more urban areas, if it's at all within financial feasibility, they probably should have some type of a bug out place to go rather than try to stay in a city. Is that your opinion?
Yeah, absolutely it is. Again, you referenced Texas, and we saw that as well. And I can never overemphasize the fact that community, both your local community, as well as having contacts that you can rely upon across the U.S. So for example, we have contacts that we can rely on and we can trust, and we've developed long-term relationships such that if something happens in Tennessee, where we are, northern Tennessee, we could immediately head to Kentucky, Arkansas, Illinois, other states that we know we would be safe. We know that there's food. And we know that the medical supplies, everything we need to shelter in place in another location until this area is deemed safe. So community is the most important aspect.
Is that a part of your relationship with that community? Basically, let's say something happens in Kentucky, that they can come to you. So basically it's almost, and this is really interesting, I haven't thought about this, because you could say, hey, local community people collaborate locally to try to get through a bad time. But now you can almost strategically say, well, let's pick, 5 different locales that are driving distance, and say that, and we have kind of this mutual agreement. If something happens in one place, we can all go to another, and it's sort of this, I don't call it a treaty, but this agreement that you have together. That's a really interesting approach. How did you put that network together? Did you just happen to know people, or did you source them out?
So it started again after 9/11. I began writing my a book, the Prepper's Handbook. Once I put that out, I began receiving a number of emails. Teach me this, explain this to me, as well as me learning from them. And over that time, decades now, I've learned and established contacts in probably just about every state within the United States. And it's been people I visited, people I trust, long-term relationships. So it was not an overnight thing. It took a long time. And especially in our community, right, in the preparedness community, is trust. You really have to have trust that people mean what they say.
Thanks so much for being here and watching that video. And can I ask you to please subscribe to our channel so you can find out when we're posting new content. You'll be alerted right away when we do. To share this with people you think might benefit from the information, and certainly it helps us if you like the video. So if you like what you just saw, go ahead and hit that like button. And again, thank you so much for being here with me right now.